Welcome to this deep dive, into international relations. We're going to be tackling a topic today that I think might make some people uncomfortable. But it's really crucial, I think, if we want to understand how nations interact. We're going to be talking about lying in diplomacy and statecraft. And I think, we generally consider honesty a virtue, but can we maintain that stance when national interests or even survival are at stake?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's something that has been debated for centuries. And John-J-Mearsheimer tackles this question head on in his book, Why Leaders Lie: The Truth About Lying in International Politics.
Now, one might assume that a book on this topic would expose rampant deception on the global stage, but Mearsheimer's argument is a bit more nuanced.
Yes, absolutely. So he posits that while lying certainly exists in international relations, it's not as common as one might think. However, he doesn't downplay its strategic importance or the potential repercussions when it does occur. And this raises a key question. Why would a scholar of Mearsheimer's stature make this seemingly counterintuitive claim?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'm glad you brought that up. To understand this, we'll be unpacking Mearsheimer's framework for examining international lies, categorized by who's being deceived. Other states, the public, or even deceptions shrouded in the language of liberal ideals. And through historical examples, we'll explore the motivations and implications of these various forms of deception.
Now, before we delve into specific types of lies, it's important to define deception in the context of statecraft. And so Mearsheimer differentiates between lying, spinning, and concealment. While all three are forms of deception, they carry different levels of intentionality and arguably moral weight.
So, think of it like a legal trial. While outright lying under oath is strictly forbidden, lawyers are expected to present their client's case in the most favorable light possible, even if it means emphasizing certain facts and downplaying others.
Right, and that's spinning, manipulating the presentation of information rather than fabricating it entirely. Concealment, on the other hand, involves omitting certain details to shape the perception of events.
So essentially, Mearsheimer argues that lying is considered more egregious than spinning or concealment for a very practical reason. It's harder to detect and defend against.
Yes, exactly. And if we connect this to the concept of bluffing in negotiations, for instance, imagine you're buying a house. Both the buyer and the seller may be less than truthful about their true reservation price, the point at which they'd walk away from the deal. And so this type of deception is actually an accepted part of the game, as both parties understand the rules and potential for such tactics.
So while deception is present, it's not necessarily seen as inherently unethical. It's when those unspoken rules are broken, when outright lies are employed to create an unfair advantage, that the situation becomes problematic.
Precisely. Now, Mearsheimer outlines 7 types of international lies: interstate lies, fear-mongering, strategic cover-ups, national smith-making, liberal lies, and then 2 types of selfish lies that we won't be discussing today. So our focus will be on the 5 strategic lies, those told in service of what leaders perceive to be the national interest, not for personal gain.
Okay, let's start with interstate lies. These are lies told to pre-nations. So it seems counterintuitive that in the anarchic world of international relations, where states are often vying for power and resources, that lying wouldn't be more prevalent.
Well, Mearsheimer attributes this to the inherent nature of international relations. States operate with a healthy dose of skepticism towards each other, particularly when vital interests are at stake. So there's an understanding that other states may not always be truthful, leading to a cautious approach in accepting information at face value.
And I would imagine this constant awareness of potential deception would make it actually quite difficult to pull off a successful lie. Because if everyone is expecting it, then the element of surprise is lost, which is crucial for effective deception.
Yeah, and I think former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir really captures this tension well. He said, "For the sake of the land of Israel, it's all right to lie." And so the statement itself acknowledges the possibility, even acceptability, of deception in pursuit of vital national interests. However, this very awareness makes other states more wary, creating a challenging environment for successful lying.
So what are some scenarios where states might engage in interstate lies?
Well, one common scenario is exaggerating military capabilities to deter potential adversaries. A prime example of this is Stalin's portrayal of the Soviet military before World War II. He wanted to project an image of strength to deter aggression, even though in reality, it was far less formidable.
And we also saw this tactic employed during the Cold War with Khrushchev's inflated claims about Soviet ICBM capabilities. Again, the goal was to deter the United States. And this just demonstrates that the goal isn't necessarily to start a conflict, but rather to prevent one by projecting strength, even if it's a facade.
Right. And conversely, states may downplay or conceal their true military capabilities to avoid provoking a rival. And so Germany's initial concealment of its naval buildup under Admiral von Tirpitz illustrates this strategy.
It sounds like a very delicate balancing act. You're trying to appear strong enough to deter aggression without being perceived as overly threatening and thus triggering a preemptive attack.
Absolutely. Another scenario involves concealing hostile intentions. A classic example is Hitler's claims of peaceful intentions in the years leading up to World War II, while meticulously planning his expansionist campaign. Here, deception serves as a tool for masking aggression and catching adversaries off guard.
We also see a lot of empty threats to deter or coerce adversaries fall into this category. Think of Germany's threat to invade Czechoslovakia in 1938, or NATO's nuclear deterrence policy during the Cold War. Both rely on the threat of force, even if the willingness to actually follow through is debatable.
Right. And of course, wartime itself significantly increases the likelihood of interstate lies. When a state's survival is perceived to be at stake, the perceived justification for deception, even if morally questionable, intensifies.
It makes sense. The stakes are undeniably higher during war, and deception can be a powerful tool for survival. This brings us to another category of international lies: fear-mongering. Now, this is where leaders lie to their own citizens, not to foreign adversaries.
Right. Fear-mongering involves intentionally exaggerating a foreign threat to manipulate public opinion and garner support for policies that might otherwise be unpopular.
This reminds me of a quote from Dean Acheson. He said that leaders sometimes need to make their arguments clearer than truth to get public buy-in on necessary measures. And this raises a big question. Where does persuasion end and manipulation begin?
It's an important question to consider. And the goals of fear-mongering are often to increase defense spending, to rally support for war, or to justify controversial policies. So while there may be genuine concern about a threat, the level of danger is often inflated to elicit a desired emotional response from the public.
One could argue that this tactic assumes the public is incapable of understanding or rationally responding to complex threats. But wouldn't such an approach ultimately backfire, eroding trust in the government once those manipulations are exposed?
You're absolutely right. That's a critical point to consider. If a government's credibility is damaged by perceived manipulation, it becomes increasingly difficult to garner genuine public support for future policies, even if those policies are legitimate and necessary.
Let's look at some historical examples of fear-mongering in U.S. foreign policy. I think President Roosevelt's handling of the Greer incident in 1941 is a really good example.
Yes, the incident involved a U.S. destroyer, the Greer, and a German submarine. And Roosevelt used this encounter to portray Germany as an aggressor. He hoped to sway public opinion towards entering World War II. However, the reality was far more nuanced, with the Greer actively assisting a British aircraft attacking the submarine.
And of course, Roosevelt omitted these crucial details, presenting a simplified and arguably deceptive narrative to achieve his desired political outcome. This incident really highlights how even seemingly minor events can be manipulated to fit a broader narrative, particularly when public opinion is divided on a critical issue like war.
Absolutely. And another example is the Johnson administration's deception surrounding the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. The alleged attacks on U.S. destroyers by North Vietnamese forces were used to justify a dramatic escalation of the Vietnam War. However, subsequent investigations revealed that the administration deliberately misrepresented the events to garner congressional and public support for military action.
These examples really show how fear-mongering can be used not only to justify entering a war, but also to escalate an existing conflict. And the consequences of such actions can be so far-reaching. You're talking about prolonged conflicts, increased casualties, and significant social and political upheaval.
And I think the long-term consequences of fear-mongering, even if successful in the short term, are often underestimated.
Yeah.
The erosion of trust in government, the potential for backlash when deceptions are revealed, and the damage to a nation's reputation on the world stage are all factors that must be weighed against the perceived benefits of such a strategy.
A more recent example that comes to mind is the Bush administration's claims about Iraq's WMD program and its alleged ties to al-Qaeda in the lead-up to the 2003 invasion. These claims, presented as irrefutable evidence of an imminent threat, were later proven to be false, leading to widespread criticism and calls for accountability.
Yes, the Bush administration's actions highlight the dangers of fear-mongering in the context of a globalized world. The rapid dissemination of information, coupled with increased scrutiny from international organizations and the public, makes it increasingly difficult to sustain deception for prolonged periods.
The fallout from the Iraq War, both domestically and internationally, demonstrates that the consequences of such actions can be profound and long-lasting.
And it underscores the importance of a critical and informed citizenry, capable of questioning official narratives, demanding evidence, and holding leaders accountable for their actions, especially when those actions involve sending a nation to war.
So, in essence, the cases we've discussed demonstrate that while fear-mongering can be a very powerful tool for shaping public opinion and achieving policy objectives, it's a tactic fraught with ethical and strategic risks. And the potential for backlash, the erosion of trust, and the long-term damage to a nation's credibility must be carefully considered before resorting to such measures.
Absolutely. Now, shifting gears slightly, let's explore another category of international lies: strategic cover-ups. These differ from concealment in that they involve actively constructing a false narrative rather than merely omitting inconvenient truths. It's about shaping the perception of events to protect reputations, deflect blame, and minimize political fallout.
And strategic cover-ups often involve deceiving both domestic and foreign audiences. The goal is to control the narrative, to prevent damaging information from coming to light, and to maintain a desired image of competence and control.
A striking example of this is France's efforts to conceal its military struggles during the Battle of Verdun in World War I. The French government downplayed the severity of their losses and setbacks, to maintain morale and avoid undermining public support for the war effort.
Another example is Israel's handling of the Kibbutz massacre in 1953. After Israeli commandos killed dozens of Palestinian civilians in a reprisal raid, the government initially blamed the massacre on Jewish settlers, and they went to great lengths to conceal the involvement of its own forces. And this highlights how strategic cover-ups can be used not only to protect national interests, but also to shield individuals and institutions from accountability. And we also have President Kennedy's denial of a deal to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey during the Cuban Missile Crisis. While historians debate the details of this agreement, Kennedy's public denial of its existence, likely motivated by a desire to avoid domestic backlash and maintain a strong negotiating position, demonstrates the complex considerations that often underpin such deceptions.
Right, and these cases raise critical questions about the balance between transparency and secrecy in government. While there may be legitimate reasons to withhold certain information for national security or strategic purposes, the potential for abuse is undeniable.
And as we've seen, strategic cover-ups can perpetuate failed policies, hinder learning from past mistakes, and ultimately undermine public trust in government. So the challenge lies in establishing clear guidelines for when such actions are justifiable and ensuring mechanisms for accountability when those lines are crossed.
Now, let's turn our attention to nationalist myth-making.
So nationalist myth-making involves creating and propagating false historical narratives that portray one's nation in a glorious light while often demonizing rivals. It's about constructing a version of history that serves contemporary political goals, shaping national identity, justifying past actions, and mobilizing citizens for collective action.
And these myths often appeal to deep-seated emotions. They tap into feelings of pride, patriotism, and belonging. They simplify complex historical events, creating heroes and villains, and often glossing over or outright denying uncomfortable truths.
A really pertinent example of this is the Zionist narrative about the creation of Israel, particularly the myth of a land empty of Palestinians. This narrative, ignoring the historical presence of Palestinians and their displacement during the 1948 war, has been used to justify Israeli territorial claims and policies towards Palestinians.
And the sanitization of American history, particularly regarding the treatment of Native Americans and the legacy of slavery, offers another example. The narratives often minimize or ignore the brutality of these chapters, presenting a simplified and idealized version of the past that serves to reinforce a particular national identity and worldview.
And nationalist myth-making, while serving to strengthen national cohesion and unity, can have detrimental consequences. By distorting history and perpetuating harmful stereotypes, such myths can hinder reconciliation efforts, fuel animosity between groups, and make it difficult to address historical injustices.
It's a very delicate balance. The challenge lies in acknowledging the complexity of history, recognizing the multiplicity of perspectives, and engaging in honest and open dialogues about the past. This requires moving beyond simplistic narratives and embracing more nuanced and inclusive understanding of history.
Now let's move on to our final category for today: liberal lies. These lies arise from the tension between a nation's actions on the world stage and its desire to present those actions as consistent with liberal values.
It's about reconciling the often harsh realities of power politics with the need to maintain a moral high ground. especially in a world that increasingly embraces liberal norms and values.
So it's about using liberal rhetoric, emphasizing principles like human rights, democracy, and international cooperation to mask actions that might be considered morally questionable or even hypocritical when judged against those very principles.
Right. This tension between realpolitik, the pursuit of national interest often through pragmatic and sometimes ruthless means, and the desire to be perceived as a force for good in the world is a recurring theme in international relations.
A stark example of this is the justification of the Allied firebombing of Dresden during World War II as a legitimate military target. The bombing resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of German civilians, yet it was defended as necessary to weaken Germany's war production and hasten the war's end.
However, critics argue that the bombing of Dresden was primarily intended to terrorize the German population and that the city's military significance was grossly overstated. The narrative presented to the public, both during and after the war, often downplayed the civilian casualties and emphasized the strategic rationale, even if that rationale was arguably flawed.
This illustrates how liberal lies can be used to reconcile horrific acts with the desire to maintain a sense of moral righteousness. The challenge lies in discerning when such justifications are genuine attempts to minimize civilian harm and when they are cynical attempts to mask morally questionable actions.
And another example is Nazi Germany's attempts to blame Poland for starting World War II and portray their invasion as an act of self-defense. This blatant distortion of reality, a clear example of historical revisionism, served to justify their aggression to the German people and the international community.
It highlights the power of narrative to shape perceptions and manipulate public opinion. By constructing a false narrative that paints oneself as the victim and the other as the aggressor, it becomes easier to justify actions that would otherwise be condemned.
Well, use of liberal lies to sanitize violence, deflect criticism, and maintain a facade of moral legitimacy raises profound ethical questions. How do we, as citizens and as members of the global community, discern truth from falsehood, particularly when those in power have a vested interest in shaping the narrative to serve their own ends?
It requires a commitment to critical thinking, a willingness to challenge official narratives, and a recognition that even in a world that espouses liberal values, the pursuit of power and national interest can sometimes lead to actions that contradict those very values.
Yeah.
So as we kind of dig deeper, into Mearsheimer's analysis of lying in international politics, this concept of liberal lies, I think it's really intriguing. And as we touched upon earlier, these are the lies that emerge from the clash between the nation's actions on the world stage and its desire to present those actions as, aligning with its professed liberal values.
Yeah, it's a fascinating paradox to consider. On one hand, you have, the real politics pursuit of national interest, often achieved through, means that are less than ideal. And then on the other hand, you have this need to maintain a certain moral high ground, especially, in a world that increasingly embraces liberal norms and principles. And it's in this tension, I think, that liberal lies really take root.
So you're saying it's about projecting an image that aligns with, these widely accepted notions of human rights and democracy and international cooperation, even if those ideals might conflict with the actions taken to secure national interests. Is it about maintaining a certain facade?
Yeah, precisely. States often find themselves in situations where their actions, while deemed strategically necessary, might be viewed as morally questionable if judged against the very liberal values that they claim to uphold. And so this creates a need to reconcile these contradictions, and that's where I think liberal lies come into play.
Would you say that this always involves intentional deception, like a deliberate effort to mislead? Or could it sometimes be about, reconciling those inherent complexities and contradictions of international politics with a genuine desire to be seen as a force for good?
Yeah, that's a really nuanced point. While some instances might involve deliberate manipulation, others might stem from a genuine belief that, certain actions, though morally ambiguous, are necessary for the greater good. It's about justifying actions that on the surface might seem to contradict a nation's stated values.
And historical examples, I think, can provide a lot of insights into this dynamic. The Allied firebombing of Dresden during World War II, I think, serves as a potent example of this tension. This devastating attack resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands of German civilians was defended as a legitimate military target necessary to cripple Germany's war production and hasten the end of the war.
Right, and yet Critics of the Dresden bombing focus on the disproportionate civilian casualties and question the city's strategic significance. They argue that the attack was primarily intended to inflict terror on the German population. And the narrative that was presented to the public both during and after the war often downplayed that civilian cost and emphasized the military rationale, even if that rationale was, debatable.
So it sounds like the narrative surrounding the Dresden bombing exemplifies how liberal lies can be used to reconcile horrific acts with the need to maintain this sense of moral righteousness. But then the question becomes, how do we discern when such justifications are genuine attempts to minimize civilian harm and when they're cynical attempts to shield actions that, might otherwise be considered war crimes?
Yeah, discerning intent is always challenging in these kinds of situations, but examining the proportionality of the attack, the availability of alternative targets in the post-action narratives, can offer some clues as to the underlying motivations and the degree to which liberal ideals were genuinely considered.
Let's shift to another example, Nazi Germany's attempts to blame Poland for starting World War II and justify their invasion as an act of self-defense. I think this demonstrates how narratives can be blatantly manipulated to serve these aggressive agendas.
Yeah, this is a classic case of historical revisionism. It's crafting a narrative
Yeah.
that, completely distorts reality to paint oneself as the victim rather than the aggressor. And the goal here is to garner support both domestically and internationally by playing on emotions and pre-existing prejudices.
And the Nazi propaganda machine was incredibly effective at shaping public opinion. They demonized Poland and justified their actions to a population that had experienced, the humiliation of defeat in World War I and the subsequent economic hardships.
Right, and this underscores the power of narrative to shape perceptions and manipulate public opinion, particularly when those narratives tap into pre-existing anxieties and resentments. And it really highlights the need for critical thinking, for challenging official narratives, and for seeking out, diverse perspectives to gain a more comprehensive understanding of events.
It's a reminder that even in a world where liberal values are so widely espoused, the pursuit of power can lead to actions that contradict those very values. And the challenge lies in discerning when justifications are genuine and when they're merely a cloak for self-interest and aggression.
And Mearsheimer argues that liberal lies, while perhaps effective in achieving short-term political goals, can have very detrimental long-term consequences. And one such consequence is the erosion of trust, in government and its institutions.
Yeah, when people discover that the narratives that they've been told are false, it can lead to cynicism and this sense of betrayal and a loss of faith in the government's ability to act honestly and transparently. And this erosion of trust can make it incredibly difficult to govern effectively and, address pressing social and political issues.
Think about, historical instances of government deception in the United States, events like the Watergate scandal or the Iran-Contra affair or the revelations about the Bush administration's claims regarding Iraq's WMD program. These incidents, when exposed, had a profoundly damaging effect on public trust in the government.
I think these instances highlight the importance of accountability, of ensuring that those in power are held responsible for their actions, particularly when those actions involve deception. Without accountability, the temptation to lie, to manipulate, and to prioritize political expediency over truth becomes increasingly difficult to resist.
Absolutely. And another significant downside of liberal lies is their potential to weaken a nation's moral standing, on the world stage. When a nation is perceived as hypocritical, as if failing to live up to its espoused values, it damages its credibility and undermines its ability to lead and influence events, on the global stage.
The Vietnam War, I think, provides a stark example of how a nation's moral standing can be tarnished by this disconnect between rhetoric and reality. The United States, positioning itself as a champion of freedom and democracy, found itself embroiled in a brutal and protracted conflict that seemed to contradict those very ideals. And that gap between words and actions eroded America's image and made it more difficult to advance its interests, on the world stage.
The Vietnam War serves as a cautionary tale. It highlights the dangers of relying on liberal rhetoric to justify actions that contradict those very principles. And it underscores the need for consistency between words and deeds, for actions that align with stated values, and for a recognition that hypocrisy, when exposed, can have far-reaching consequences.
And the cases that we've discussed, I think, underscore that even with the best intentions, the pursuit of national interest can lead down this path of deception and hypocrisy, potentially undermining the very values a nation claims to defend. This raises really important questions about how we as citizens and as members of the global community can hold our leaders accountable, demand transparency, and ensure that the pursuit of power does not come at the expense of truth and justice.
Yeah, and Mearsheimer doesn't stop at merely highlighting the consequences of liberal lies. He goes further to argue that pervasive lying can have a corrosive effect on a nation's political culture, gradually normalizing deception and chipping away at the ethical foundations of statecraft.
And this is a particularly alarming prospect. When lying becomes commonplace, when it's seen as an acceptable, even expected part of political maneuvering, it creates a very dangerous precedent. The line between truth and falsehood becomes blurred, making it increasingly difficult to discern fact from fiction and eroding public trust in institutions and in those who govern.
Imagine a political environment where deception is not just tolerated but celebrated, where those who lie most effectively are rewarded, and where honesty is seen as a weakness rather than a virtue. Such an environment breeds cynicism and distrust and a corrosive disregard for truth.
And I think we're already witnessing a rise in disinformation and the proliferation of conspiracy theories and a growing polarization of political discourse. These trends point to a breakdown in our shared understanding of truth and the importance of honesty in public life.
These developments pose a significant threat to democratic societies, which rely on an informed citizenry capable of engaging in reasoned debate, making sound judgments, and holding those in power accountable. When truth itself becomes a casualty in the political arena, the foundations of a functioning democracy are weakened.
This underscores the urgent need for media literacy, for fostering critical thinking skills, and for promoting a culture that values truth and holds those who spread falsehoods accountable.
It's about equipping citizens with the tools to discern fact from fiction, to critically evaluate information sources, and to recognize, the various tactics employed to manipulate and mislead. It's about creating a more discerning and informed public that is resistant to the allure of simplistic narratives and the seductive power of disinformation.
It's also about recognizing that we all have a role to play in upholding truth and combating deception. It's about being willing to challenge falsehoods, to call out hypocrisy, and to demand better from our leaders and from each other.
Absolutely. Creating a more honest and ethical political environment requires a collective effort, a commitment to truth-telling, and a willingness to hold those who lie accountable. It's about recognizing that while deception might offer short-term gains, the long-term consequences for a society can be devastating.
So how do we grapple with this inherent tension between national interest and the desire to adhere to liberal values?
Yeah.
How do we incentivize honesty in a world where deception is often seen as a necessary tool of statecraft?
These are questions that demand our attention and our collective wisdom. And Mearsheimer offers some potential avenues for promoting honesty, but ultimately it's up to us as citizens and as members of the global community to create a system where honesty is not just an aspiration, but a practical necessity.
Well, we've journeyed through these various types of international lies. We've examined their motivations and, their potential effectiveness and the often underestimated consequences. And I think it's unsettling to acknowledge that deception, plays a role in statecraft, especially in a world that is, striving for honesty and transparency.
Right, it's a reality we must confront. And I think Mearsheimer's analysis suggests that while lying might seem expedient in the moment and perhaps even, achieve short-term objectives, it often leads to these long-term repercussions that can harm a nation's interests and really erode its global standing.
And we've seen this pattern repeatedly in history, right? The Vietnam War, the Iraq War. These instances demonstrate how deceptions, even if initially concealed, eventually erode public trust, fuel cynicism, and lead to conflicts with enduring consequences.
And I think the damage extends beyond just the immediate fallout of these lies. It's about the gradual erosion of norms, the normalization of deception, and the corrosive impact this has on a nation's political culture. It undermines a nation's capacity for genuine engagement and cooperation, with others.
And trust, as we've discussed, is such a crucial element in international relations. And once fractured, it's incredibly difficult to rebuild.
And I think Mearsheimer's argument really resonates here. Honesty, even when challenging, even when politically inconvenient, ultimately serves a nation's interests better than resorting to these short-term deceptions that could ultimately backfire and damage its credibility.
But then how do we reconcile this ideal with the realities of power dynamics in international relations, right? When nations are constantly vying for advantage, when competition is fierce and survival is often perceived to be at stake, doesn't deception become a necessary tool, a way to navigate this complex and often treacherous landscape?
Yeah, it's a dilemma that has persisted throughout history.
Right.
And there's no easy solution. But Mearsheimer suggests that focusing on the long game, building a reputation for honesty and reliability yields greater benefits than engaging in these short-term deceptions that could ultimately backfire.
So it's about recognizing that a nation's reputation has these tangible consequences. A nation known for its trustworthiness is better positioned to forge alliances, to negotiate favorable agreements, and to exert influence on the global stage.
Yeah, and I think deception can actually be a self-defeating strategy. When nations consistently lie to each other, it breeds this atmosphere of suspicion and distrust that makes cooperation difficult and increases the risk of conflict.
This reminds me of the prisoner's dilemma. When both sides distrust each other, they're inclined to make choices that lead to these suboptimal outcomes for everyone involved. They forego the potential benefits of cooperation out of fear of being exploited.
Right, and that analogy applies not only to, relations between nations, but also to the relationship between a government and its people. When a government repeatedly deceives its citizens, it erodes the trust that is so fundamental to a functioning democracy.
And we've witnessed this globally. When people lose faith in their leaders, when they believe that the system is rigged against them, it can lead to social unrest, political instability, and even violence.
And this emphasizes that honesty and transparency are essential for building a just and equitable society, a society where citizens feel like their voices are heard and believe that their government is acting in their best interests.
So then how do we move forward? If lying is so ingrained in international relations, how do we create a system where honesty is not just an aspiration, but a practical reality, a guiding principle for how nations interact?
Yeah, that's the challenge before us. And it requires, I think, a multi-pronged approach. And Mearsheimer offers several pathways, to promote honesty in statecraft.
So what concrete steps, can we take to create a more ethical and transparent system of international relations? A system where honesty is not naive idealism, but a pragmatic and essential element of statecraft.
Well, one crucial step is strengthening international institutions and norms that promote accountability and transparency. Organizations like the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, and various human rights bodies play a vital role in holding nations accountable for their actions and exposing deceptions.
So it's about establishing consequences for lying, preventing nations from acting with impunity and expecting to evade scrutiny.
Exactly. Another essential step is empowering a free and independent press. Journalists play such a critical role in investigating wrongdoing, exposing corruption, and holding those in power accountable.
History is just filled with examples of investigative journalism uncovering truths that, those in power would have preferred to remain hidden. Watergate, the Panama Papers. These demonstrate the power of a free press to expose deception and hold those responsible to account.
And a free press is not merely a pillar of a healthy democracy, but a critical component of a more just and equitable world.
It's also about, educating citizens to be more discerning consumers of information.
Yeah.
Recognizing the various ways that they might be deceived and demanding honesty and transparency from their leaders.
Right. Critical thinking skills are so essential in today's information-saturated world. It's becoming increasingly challenging to separate fact from fiction.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We need to equip people with the tools to question assumptions, to evaluate evidence, and to approach claims with a healthy skepticism, especially when those claims are lacking supporting data or rely on emotional appeals rather than reasoned arguments.
And fostering a culture of open dialogue and debate where different perspectives are valued and dissent is not stifled but encouraged is equally important.
And this is particularly crucial in our increasingly polarized world, where people often retreat into echo chambers and just dismiss information that challenges their preconceived notions.
Right. Creating spaces where people can engage with complex issues, challenge each other's assumptions, and work collaboratively to find solutions to shared problems is essential.
It's about acknowledging that, truth is often multifaceted and nuanced, and achieving a shared understanding requires a willingness to listen to diverse perspectives and engage in, respectful dialogue, even when those perspectives differ from our own.
Absolutely. Ultimately, promoting honesty and transparency in public life is a collective responsibility. We can't passively wait for others to address these issues. Each of us has a role to play in speaking truth to power, challenging deception when we encounter it, and demanding better from our leaders.
So it's about recognizing that creating a more just and equitable world requires a commitment to honesty, both in our personal lives and in our interactions within the global community.
We hope that, exploring this complex world of international lying has provided you with some valuable insights and perhaps even inspired you to take action in your own life to promote a more honest and transparent world.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah.
And we encourage you to continue exploring these issues, engaging in thoughtful discussions about how we can create a world where honesty is not simply a virtue, but a foundational principle for a more just and peaceful future.